You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who fear stock market failure. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. I'm Cole Smead, President and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management. At our firm, we're readers and book junkies. It can be said that leaders are readers, and we believe books provide us a great source of information for filtering what is and isn't important for investors. Investing is the last great liberal art and the best way to spend a lifetime of learning. This podcast is for readers, thinkers, business-minded people, and investors who want to grow their knowledge from great authors and their writing. Charlie Munger often talks about using multiple mental models and analysis. Our aim is for this podcast to help listeners test Munger's theory in business, markets, and people. I'm glad you joined us for today's episode. I personally think we're going to have a lot of fun and hear some great stories with our guest. Greg Zuckerman is joining us to talk about his book, The Frackers, that was published in 2013. Greg is an investigative journalist with the Wall Street Journal. He is also the author of 5 other books, including his 2009 book, The Greatest Trade Ever, and his newest book titled A Shot to Save the World, The Inside Story of the Life or Death Race for a COVID-19 Vaccine. Before introducing Greg, I'd just like to tell listeners that I believe Greg's book, The Frackers, is a seminal book to understanding how we got to where we are in the energy business in 2021, and why those businesses, in many cases, have the current sentiment they do among investors. So with no further ado, Greg, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, great to be here.
So Greg, you're probably gaining. I'm probably the biggest fanboy as it pertains to your book. I really enjoyed it, and I have to ask. Like, you live in New Jersey. What inspired you to write this book?
That's a good question. I'm a East Coast guy, and my wife's from the West Coast, so I had never been to some of these places, little towns in Oklahoma and Texas and Louisiana. What inspired me was just the fact that this was the most important business story at the time, and it hadn't been written, frankly, how we as a nation transformed from one desperate for oil and gas. We were running out, and to the point where we were exporting it. I mean, it sounded absurd to me, and frankly, it just hadn't been told the full story, who the people were behind it. What were their stories? How did they pull it off? Why was it these people, these unlikely characters and companies, and it wasn't the people you would have expected? And I looked around and no one had told that story, and I wanted to be the one to travel the country and understand that story and tell it to the world.
So we kind of talked about this prior to the show. You enjoy getting into the lives of people and kind of telling their story. And I mean, you have some really big characters in the story. You have George Mitchell, you have Tom Ward and McClendon, you have Harold Hamm, you have Papa in this story, but you kind of use Mitchell as your starting off point for talking about really how this industry evolved, and I have to assume that meeting George Mitchell or talking with his family was quite an interesting story to think about fracking and how this business progressed, and even geography, because I mean, he had been there since the 1960s.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story about him. So he was my first interview for this book, I think. I probably talked to an analyst or two, but in terms of the main character. So I flew out to Houston, and here I am, this East Coast guy who doesn't know that much about energy. I've done a little bit of writing about energy, but not that much. And I got to sit down with George, and it's a real privilege. Obviously, he's the father or the grandfather of this fracking revolution. But as a writer, you want to make your subjects, your characters comfortable. You want to have something in common that often helps to get them comfortable. And I was wary flying out there. What do I know from George Mitchell, this big Houston oil baron? And so we sit down together, we start talking, and he tells me the story of his life. And he tells me about his father, Savas Paraskopopoulos, and he says how Savas was an immigrant from a little town in Greece, came over, they off Ellis Island, they said go work on the building the rails from I think it was Arkansas to Texas, And one day his paymaster comes to him and says, Savas, I can't spell this name. What's with this name of yours? And Savas says, well, what's your name? He goes, my name is Mike Mitchell. And Savas is like, all right, I'll be Mike Mitchell too. He took his name, and his son is George Mitchell. And I love that story for so many reasons, but among them is the fact that my great-grandfather got off the boat at Ellis Island. They said, what's your name? And he said, Rumshinsky. And they're like, nah, we can't spell that. Take the last guy that just came through. His name was Zuckerman. So we had a lot in common, more common than you would have thought. So, and I think that's sort of emblematic of this whole book and this project for me, because the more I got to meet the oil barons and the fracking kings, all that kind of stuff, and people that are so different from me, you realize how similar we all are. And that was one of the real themes of my research. And yeah, George was just a fascinating guy. He's an entrepreneur. He's a resilient businessman, creative, innovative. He's everything you love about America and about American business.
Yeah, and George, what you lay out in your story is really that George kind of did two things in an incredible way that led the industry, which was, first off, his technique. In other words, the idea of fracking itself, and then secondly, geography, because the fracking would take them into geographies that people hadn't been before.
Yeah, listen, he's so impressive in so many ways. His perseverance. He's that sort of true immigrant story. He and his family, but just the fact that he had to persevere over, forget about outsiders and skeptics who said, yes, fracking, and we understand shale. Shale's always been there. We know there's a lot of oil and gas packed into shale, but don't waste your time on it. He had skeptics within his own company. His own president, Bill Stevens, opposed fracking in the Barnett Shale. He was the president of his own company. Sometimes he had to work behind his president's back. And frankly, he was approaching 80 years old when they had their breakthrough. He had survived cancer. His wife had Alzheimer's. He had different problems, debt problems. He couldn't pay his charitable pledges. It was a little embarrassing. I just love that perseverance, that resilience.
The idea of energy independence, 20 years ago, that was thought as impossible. As we talked about, even 15 years ago, that no one thought that was possible either. Are you blown away that we've gone from this conversation of we'll never be energy independent, we'll always be dependent on foreign oil, to we have maybe the world's greatest glut of energy and have to take it somewhere?
Yeah, I don't think the average citizen is aware or appreciative enough of how much things have changed. I still have a vague memory of being in the backseat of my parents' car in 1973 on a long line to get gas at the pump due to the Arab energy boycott, the oil boycott. And it was just an understood thing as I was in school, high school, and college, that we were dependent on others and that there was no way out. And even we had a president who was an oil man, and he didn't suggest any kind of revolution was in the offing. And it was just sort of conventional wisdom that we were running out of oil and gas in the United States. And then to the beat, today we're at the point where we're exporting it. We have so much we're exporting gas, even oil. We were exporting crude to the Saudis a few years ago. It's a crazy concept that I don't think people properly appreciate.
Yeah. So in your book, one of the most interesting characters for this idea of exporting is Sharif Suki, who you tell the story. Like you said earlier, classic American story, Lebanese immigrant who gets this idea to in effect import natural gas under the heading of we don't have enough here in the United States. Could you kind of teach our listeners that story out of your book, because I think it's fascinating to see the pivot and the about face that he had to do.
Yeah, there are really fewer more unlikely characters to lead the U.S. energy revolution than Sharif Suki. He's an immigrant from Lebanon. He spent years as an investment banker. He retired to go ski in Aspen. He started some bars and some restaurants there and in Los Angeles. And he started a restaurant called the Mezzaluna Restaurant, which is pretty well known for a while, or infamous, I should say, because that's where the O.J. Simpson murder was centered around that restaurant. And Nicole Brown Simpson was in that restaurant one evening and left her glasses there in the restaurant. And then a young man brought the glasses to her home. And then O.J. Simpson allegedly murdered them both. And that restaurant for a while was just world renowned. People came from all over the world to go there afterwards. And Sharif Suki was kind of sickened by the whole thing. He's like, they're coming here not for the food, but because there was a murder associated with my restaurant. And he just needed something new. He was running out of money. And he thought at the time, the oil and gas industry, there was a lot of underinvestment. This is around the time of the dot-com boom and bubble, around 2000 or so. And he saw the money was going elsewhere to technology and other kind of shares and companies, and not enough was going to oil and gas. So he said, all right, maybe I can focus on oil and gas. And he started an exploration company. Didn't really work. But then he said, okay, well, what if we start importing gas into the United States? Because all the experts say we're running out of oil and gas, so maybe we should be importing oil and gas. And he's a really persuasive, convincing individual, and he raised billions and billions of dollars to build these huge plants in Louisiana to import natural gas. And here we are on the eve of the early parts of the U.S. energy revolution, and all of a sudden we have the surplus of gas that's developing. And he talked to people like Aubrey McClendon, and they were like, yeah, we're producing so much gas in this country, so much of it. I don't know why you're importing it. Can you imagine importing gas when there's a glut coming in? He was in trouble. He and his company, Cheniere Energy, were truly in trouble, and they didn't really have a solution. So Sharif Suki and Cheniere were in trouble. They were about to import natural gas amid a glut of it. So to his credit, Sharif Suki could have just said, all right, we're done here. I'm going to move on to some other industry, some other approach. But instead he said, I'm going to try to figure out a solution. And his solution was, well, hold on a second, guys. If you're saying that there's going to be a glut in the United States due to all this shale production, maybe instead of importing natural gas, we should be exporting it. And his investors, he was lucky because the stock was so cheap at the time. His investors had no solutions, and they had written down their investment. So they're like, yeah, Sharif, if you want to give it a shot, try. And he did. And he basically raised billions and billions more additional capital to turn their facilities into export facilities. It's not so easy to do. And I really am impressed by that resilience and that perseverance and that creativity. And yeah, they turned Cheniere into the biggest gas exporter. So it's an impressive story in my view.
Yeah, to your point, the 99-2000 period was kind of a central period for a lot of the businesses and people in your book. As you mentioned, Suki had they had to deal with this in effect, what was thought to be a scarcity, then a glut. But it was tough to raise capital for a lot of these people, whether it be Harold Hamm, George Mitchell. I'm kind of cheating ahead on this, but a lot of the parallels of then seem like they're kind of ringing in our ears now. And I don't know if that's something you've kind of paralleled with that period in the oil and gas business.
It's a great point. I hadn't thought about it, frankly, but yes, in many ways, there are similarities in that it's just hard to get capital if you're in the oil and gas business today, both from the banks, from investors, and frankly, there's been a change on the part of there aren't as many independents anymore. Those independents, wildcatters and such, just have a difficulty. They can't production. It's not all about production. It's about cash flow and earnings for the first time forever. So yes, there are a lot of parallels, and you would think there'd be opportunities too. When an industry has underinvestment or lack of investment, by definition, those who have capital should be able to see opportunity.
Yeah, because you go through some of the cycles of this industry. You talked a lot. I remember catching parts of your book where you highlighted how Harold Hamm, this figure that we haven't talked much about so far, who was obviously poor Oklahoma kid, comes from a very simple means, and ends up getting in the drilling and fracking and oil business. But he does that both with the drilling and the oil side, and then ends up selling kind of fortuitously his drilling business at maybe the best time an Oklahoman's ever seen.
Yeah, Harold Hamm is a fascinating character. He may be the most interesting, in my view, in the book, just the rags to riches story. He grew up the youngest of 13 children. He couldn't even start school each year until after Christmas because his parents were poor and he had to help them. They were sharecroppers, and he had to help them work the fields. And only by the time around December, late December, Christmas time, was it so cold that he couldn't help anymore. He was no longer needed in the fields. So, I mean, he was so poor that he told me a story that he got his first pair of his first pair of new shoes was when his little shack of a home burned down, and his neighbors chipped in and got him a pair of shoes. And you could see in his face, it was sort of a positive story. It burnt down, so they had to step up, and people chipped in, and he got a new pair of shoes, and he remembered the experience as being a positive one, when most others would kind of see their home burning down as a negative experience. And then he didn't have a geology degree in any kind. He pumped gas for $1 an hour after earning his high school credits, and he started as low as he can get, kind of cleaning out the muck, the sediment from oil tankers in the bottom of those trucks, and climbing in there and raking out the debris, the sediment from these tankers. And frankly, for years, so then he threw himself into the oil business. He kind of said, all right, I don't want to be poor anymore. I want to have some wealth. And who's wealthy? It's these oil guys that I see around me. And he said, I want to be like them. And he picked their brains, and he learned from them. And his education was sort of ad hoc and on the fly. But he said, I'm going to be like these guys. I'm going to save my money, which he did. And he's going to do some exploration, which he did. And he made some money and locally in Oklahoma. And I visited the little town that he's from, Enid, and I saw the home that he grew up in, and his father was a local pastor, and I got to experience it and talk to people, and it was just a privilege and a pleasure to go to see some of these towns in America where that kind of birthed this revolution. And anyway, Harold Hamm, he started this company, and people snickered. People made fun of him. He talked rough. He went to Dale Carnegie at one point to try to improve the way he presented himself. He had this story where he was in an airplane and he was trying to fly it, and he didn't put the brake on, and it crashed into a car, and people mocked him, and he was always suing people. But again, he had no geology or any other kind of course in college. He's from this little town, Enid, the ninth largest in Oklahoma. But he heard about the Bakken, and he heard about the promise of the Bakken, and he kind of believed in the tight limestone there and that area, North Dakota, Montana, and he thought it might yield a lot of oil, even though the experts said don't waste your time there. And he went up there, and he made his big bet on the Bakken when other people could have. All the Exxon and the majors, they'd given up on America. They were offshore. They were in Africa. They were in Asia. They weren't betting on America. And Harold Hamm and the other people in my book, The Frackers, were. And I just love that belief in both this country and the promise of the natural resources, but in the what we could do, what we could innovate, how creative we could be, and that's what he was. And listen, part of my book is about gas, and the people believed in gas, and that's Aubrey McClendon and Tom Ward and others. But oil is even harder to get from shale and from some of this tight rock, and that's what Harold Hamm was about.
Yeah, so Harold is really kind of the central character of the story, as I felt as a reader. And he kind of, back to the cycles of this, he sold his drilling business. I think you said in your book it was in 1982 for like $30 million. So, I mean, he had made good money early on, and then a lot of these characters had to walk through the crisis that Oklahoma had with Penn Square, failing. And interestingly, Greg, I've been to Penn Square just by random circumstances. Was that Penn Square discussion for these Oklahoma people? I mean, was that as big of a tipping point in the local economy and the industry as your book led on to be?
Oh, it was huge. Yeah, you can't not talk to veterans without hearing stories about that period. And frankly, there are these people there. Oil and gas generally, they've gone through cycles, and outsiders don't appreciate the resilience and the ability to handle some of these ups and downs. So, we in the press will write about the latest downturn, such as the difficulties right now. And I'm not saying it's not difficult and challenging. It is. But when you talk to veterans, they say, Greg, come on, we've gone through so much in this industry. If you've been in this industry a few decades, there are so many ups and downs. They never get too high. They never get too low. And it's a real trademark of the industry and the veterans of the industry. They've been through it all, and they don't blow their money in some ways. They like maybe some other industries. They're not buying. Sometimes they're buying like the big ocean liner kind of things, and even sort of the landman. When they're making a lot of money, they seem to save it. I'm not saying they don't enjoy themselves as well, but they save a little bit more, because they know right around the bend there's going to be some downturn. It's a ups and downs, the volatility that I think other people couldn't handle. But when you talk to veterans, they just sort of they know it's a ride. It's a volatile industry, and they're prepared for that.
Yeah, you pointed out in your book that oil went from $36 in 1981 to $15 in 1986. I know the late Boone Pickens had put a quote on the front of your book, but that was kind of a Boone Pickens era, and I know your book didn't talk a lot about that, but in many ways, the people that survived that were really the seeds of your book, because that's who got to finally build the energy independence in the end.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The survivors have the capital, and they have the experience and the knowledge, and I think you could say the same thing today. Those who can get through this period will do quite well, because this industry is full of ups and downs. There's another downturn right around the bend, but there's also another upturn, and it's all about. The thing that impressed me the most is the technological innovation in this industry. So people in the media, and I talk about my brethren here, we think of Silicon Valley when it comes to American technological innovation. You don't think of the oil and gas industry, and that's just so wrong. When you think of horizontal drilling, how it's perfected, that's the other half of the revolution. We talk about fracking, but horizontal drilling is just as important. And to go from, to I guess it was about maybe a 30 multi-staged fracking at one point when I was writing the book, and they've improved on that since then. And that's so innovative, and people don't understand. The average layman doesn't understand the creativity in the industry, and it's a technological revolution as well.
So you kind of get into some of the interesting history of the idea of breaking up rock. You talk about Civil War situations and others that kind of created some of these original ideas. Why is it, do you think, that fracking and horizontal drilling took so long to catch on? Was it just the unique geographies that people ran into, or was it just stupid thinking in the industry itself?
It's a combination of two things. First of all, it's very expensive. So you need high oil and gas prices to justify investing. So listen, everyone knew shale was packed with oil and gas, but it was just too far down there, too challenging a rock, too expensive to get at, and so it took higher prices. But part of it also is just the conventional wisdom in an industry, and it's not just the oil and gas industry. I talk about it a lot. I mean, I just wrote a book about the vaccine revolution and how we develop these effective vaccines to save the world. Companies that are just as unlikely as Mitchell and Hamm's company, this company Moderna in Cambridge that no one really cared much about. And there were a lot of similarities, believe it or not. So mRNA is an approach that everyone said, yeah, maybe it could work, but probably not. And there were some stubborn scientists that ignored the conventional wisdom. And that was exactly what happened here. People said, yeah, fracking hypothetically could work, or shale, yeah, it's an interesting rock. It's got all that oil and gas, but don't waste your time on it. And it took guys like George Mitchell and his team, the people I write about, and Harold Hamm and Aubrey McClendon, to ignore the conventional wisdom. And sometimes you do. And the conventional wisdom among the giants was, don't waste your time with shale. And it took these stubborn entrepreneurs, these wildcatters, to ignore the conventional wisdom. When everyone else preached, go to Africa, go to Asia, go anywhere but America. I mean, Exxon headquarters are literally on top of ground zero for this fracking revolution, the Barnett Shale. And was Exxon exploring in the Barnett? No, they were going anywhere but their own literal backyard. And it took George Mitchell and these other stubborn entrepreneurs to ignore the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, so there's this interaction, like you said, it takes a lot of capital to frack and do these exercises and techniques. And so there's this constant interaction in your book between the public markets and these companies, and that's enhanced by, like we said, the cycles, the Penn Square situation. Mitchell, developing the Woodlands is kind of a sideshow to his life, and selling out in '01. And then you have Chesapeake, who went as low as $1 in '99. So I guess capital structure, time and time again, was really important for these people. Your book kind of goes through the idea that some were good and some were bad, and some had great ideas and could never make it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I talk about some wildcatters and others who believed in shale just as much as George Mitchell. They believed in tight rock just as much as Harold Hamm. I could go on, and yet they didn't make it. They didn't succeed. They had abject failure, embarrassing failure often. And I think it's important to tell their stories as well, just to show that it wasn't just about the idea and not just about seizing on shale and similar kinds of rock formations. It takes a lot more. You got to have investors that are lined up, that believe in you, that will stay with you, that have capital, that won't flee at the first sign of failure. Not everyone had that, and people like Aubrey McClendon and Harold Hamm are not just creative and innovative; they're also very persuasive, and they have a way with investors, and they have a way of Aubrey's no longer with us, but they had a way of reassuring nervous backers, and that's just as important as the ideas and the creativity. And there's a real lesson there as well for the entrepreneurs and for those thinking about starting companies or looking to back new ones.
Yeah, to your point about McClendon, if there was ever kind of a love child between Wall Street and the oil business, Aubrey, he seemed to be that. His family's background that you kind of lay out. So I'd love you to take listeners just through a little bit about Aubrey, because he maybe understood the public markets better than anyone.
Aubrey McClendon was such a fascinating guy. People have said to me after reading The Frackers, Greg, I really like the book. I just don't know if I like these characters. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, which is a fine reaction, and it's not a bad one to have. They're great characters. No one more so than Aubrey McClendon. He was born to Oklahoma oil nobility, sort of. His mother's family was part of the Kerr-McGee family, but not the right side of that family. So they had money, but not a ton of money. And he goes to Duke. He's not necessarily set on joining the family industry and becoming an oil and gas person. I think he was going to be an accountant. He majored in political science, but he decides to try the family business a little bit, comes back to Oklahoma and goes into the industry. And he's very charismatic. He's a landman. And he realizes, hey, the real money is in exploration. So he shifts gears and he tries his hands at exploration. And frankly, he's a fast follower in shale. He's not like George Mitchell. He didn't come up with the idea of targeting shale, but he realizes early on in the revolution, hey, I think there's something going on here. I think that this country, we can produce a lot of gas. He was all about natural gas, at least at that point. And he says, I'm going to be the one to do it. And it's a land grab like never before seen in the nation. He borrowed, he bought, himself borrowed personally money to buy shares of his company. He believed. He was a believer. I love that. So, in other industries, sometimes you see people selling on the way up. He was buying on the way up. No one believed more in his approach, but in this nation, in the possibilities of natural gas from shale, no one believed more than Aubrey McClendon himself. And as natural gas prices climbed in early 2008, he was worth about $3 billion. He was part owner of the Oklahoma basketball franchise. He brought them to Oklahoma, the Thunder. he enjoyed the limelight. There was no one really bigger and more outgoing and charismatic than Aubrey McClendon. And the problem was he believed too much. He went back and borrowed even more on the way up. And then when he was a victim of his own success, that he found so much gas, he and his colleagues, other companies too, he found so much gas that gas prices collapsed. They went from about $13 to about $2 in 2012. So his stock dropped, and his debt he had to deal with, and he basically was tossed out of his company that he founded. So in some ways, he was a little naive and he believed too much. So I have a soft spot in my heart for Aubrey, because in the end it did not work out, and eventually, sadly, he died in mysterious circumstances. But we have him to thank in a lot of ways, he and his colleagues, Tom Ward and others, for believing in this country and believing in innovation and gobbling up all that land and producing so much gas. And frankly, it's helped us transition to alternatives, I would argue, and get away from coal. So he's a controversial figure, but I would argue that at the end of the day, he's one we can learn from and definitely be entertained by.
Yeah, as a Seattle kid growing up, rereading your story and listening to him partnering with Clay Bennett to take the Sonics away has always been a painful part of your book.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And like you said, they were having so much success. It's the kind of stuff that's prone to cause issues. Could you? I have to jump into this because it's too interesting from a corporate perspective. Could you talk about what their headquarters, kind of the opulence that you lay out, and then also what Ward and McClendon were doing on the side personally?
Yes, so Oklahoma City was a bit of a backwater before Aubrey McClendon got there. I don't want to exaggerate his importance, but he is among the most important figures, maybe the most important figure in that city over the past 100 years or so. What he brought in there, it wasn't just the growth of Chesapeake and the hiring, obviously, but they invested in the city, and part of it was the basketball team, as you suggest, but it was more than that. Just restaurants started up nearby, Whole Foods, the headquarters itself was an impressive place. People wanted to work there. It kind of put Oklahoma City on the map, and it's a pretty cool city. I've been there, spent time there. I like it a lot. So, they still give him credit for that. I mean, Tom Ward to some extent too, but Aubrey had this vision and a confidence and a charisma that is just unmatched in other industries. Maybe you get it in the high-tech world to some extent in Silicon Valley, but only the oil and gas business really has these kind of outgoing salesmen. And I say that in a positive sense, not a negative terminology, but listen, you've got to convince investors, backers, that there's something deep down in the ground, well below the surface, be it oil or gas or both, that is promising, and they can't see it. Your investors have to be persuaded, and it lends itself to the opportunity for people like Aubrey McClendon. And yeah, it wasn't just about oil and gas for him. He believed in Oklahoma City, and he really built it, helped it, put it on the map.
Yeah. So to your point, he was persuasive, but obviously, back to our idea of capital. You kind of go to the well one too many times, and you can run into a lot of trouble. Obviously, many people did that. You talked about Devorin in your book, who did that. Oryx ran into that tough stretch. A lot of this is still that interaction between, like a charismatic salesman and a banker and these investors at the end of the day. And kind of the question that I cropped up in my mind, to your point about a visionary, is what does this mean for investors? What was your, as an investor personally, what did you take away from a lot of this? Was it something that interested you, or is it something you just looked and said, what, if there's a good salesman, I might not want to be at the table?
So it's really interesting. The era of the Frackers, and my book is about these companies, it's about these individuals, the characters, and I really do spend a lot of time focused on the geologists, the people who don't get a lot of credit but are responsible for this revolution. And I would argue that net, it benefited this revolution. All the oil and gas that was discovered, it benefited the nation so much in terms of jobs, in terms of the types of cities, types of towns that benefited. I've traveled the country. It's often places that were down for the count, and they didn't have industry, and all of a sudden, people were buying up land. People that were losing farms could stay on their farms and their properties. There were people who benefited who were veterans. A lot of veterans benefited from this industry and from this revolution. So the country benefited as a whole. The economy did. And you have to remember, it was right on the heels of the housing collapse. So to have a shot in the arm, as it were, from this industry in terms of hiring and the production was a true benefit. So the country benefited. You could also argue, I would argue, that net, it helped the environment because we were able to shift away from coal and embrace natural gas. Now, you could argue that we didn't do it fast enough. They haven't done a great job, and they really have not done a very good job in terms of the escape of natural gas in terms of production. And when you travel around North Dakota like I did, and you see the flaring at night, and it's beautiful, but it's very troubling. But again, the nation benefited. These companies, the characters benefited. The people, cities like Oklahoma did. But to get to your point, the investors did not. And it was almost like a Robin Hood kind of thing. I felt that people like Auburn McClendon were, I don't want to say stealing. They were not stealing, but they were taking from the rich, broadly speaking, the investors, and I don't want to say give it to the poor, but giving it to others, sometimes poorer people. But the investors were the ones who never saw, I wouldn't say never saw, often didn't see the benefit in terms of production. In production they saw, but in terms of profits, in terms of cash flow. And it always struck me as an outsider as being quite surprising, because the investors at the time were always emphasizing production. And I don't know, I'm a sort of old school investor kind of person. I grew up reading a lot of these books, Buffett and others, and I thought earnings, or at least cash flow, were something they should be focused on. And people always said at the time, well, eventually we're going to shift to that, Greg. We're going to get to the period where profits matter and revenues matter and cash flow, free cash flow matters. And I did see that in the cable industry years earlier, the same kind of thing where they spent, and eventually investors prioritized cash flow. And until, I would argue, just a couple of years ago, that was still the case in the oil and gas industry. Right now we're speaking at the end of 2021, and things have changed. So now, finally, people are very focused on cash flow and earnings, and it's not all about production. And it's been really hard for people like Harold Hamm and others of the pioneers to shift gears. Their whole mindset forever in this industry was about production. It was like a mantra and almost a macho kind of thing. I'm going to get more production than you. And it was not about earnings. And everything is turned on a dime. So to your point, it's a really good one that it's not so clear that the investors were the priority. They were not the priority during this revolution. Everything else but cash flow and free cash flow was important. But that has changed. And they have gotten religion. I do have to say, the people like Harold Hamm, they say that he's changed, and for good reason. He owns a lot of shares. They all own a lot of shares. They're all big believers in their own companies, and they realize that maybe production shouldn't be the emphasis. Maybe if we could just keep it steady and slow, and we can make a lot of money, we can all benefit.
Yeah, to your point, I mean, the excitement, that whole energy independence that we talked about earlier, that excitement was, just a kind of a theme out of the people that bled into the country, in effect. And I'm sure you remember, like I did, that was ultimately the pitch for investors, was this idea of energy independence. When you see that kind of excitement, does that just kind of scare you personally as an investor? Because, in comparison, we kind of sit at the opposite end of that excitement from a sentiment standpoint.
Yes, as an investor, as an individual, as a citizen, right, the whole geopolitics of it is very exciting too. We haven't really touched on that, but that's a tremendous benefit from this revolution. Just the fact that we're not beholden to people like the Saudis and people in the Gulf. We've got so much production and potential still in places like the Bakken and originally the Barnett and other places in this country. it's allowed us to have so much more freedom internationally in terms of geopolitics. But as an investor, as you said, right, it's on the backs of the investors. All this stuff, all the changes, all the positives are really thanks to the investors. They don't get enough credit for writing these checks and plowing money into companies like Chesapeake and Continental and others back in the day, and they did not benefit to the large extent, not as much as they should have. And you know, there's been a lot written about how little free cash flow emerged from these revolutionary characters and companies, but I do think that's changed.
Yeah, because the last time a consolidation that was really seen in this industry was in that late 90s, early 2000s period where, you know, you had Mitchell get bought by Devon. You had, you know, in the following 5 years, you had the likes of Aubrey McClendon and Tom Ward consolidating. How did you look at the consolidation of then, kind of like today? Do you look at that as a big positive, or, you know, in studying these people and these companies, what's your take on those big consolidation periods?
So as an investor, it's really positive. As a writer, it's negative. Why? Because the characters aren't there like they used to. There's some, but it's harder to be an independent. It's harder to step up and be an Aubrey McClendon or Harold Hamm and just persuade some backer that you're going to target some new formation and everybody's got it wrong. All the majors don't know what they're talking about, and I'm going to show and American innovation is going to change things. It can still happen, and in this shakeout, I bet you there's some really interesting entrepreneurs who are going to emerge. And frankly, if you've got ideas or your audience does, I'd love to hear about them. I'd love to write about them for the journal. But it's changed in that regard. And I guess it's a positive for the industry, the shakeout, the consolidation, the most successful and efficient will survive. And for the future, that is the way it should be, if I'm putting on my business hat lens. But just as a writer looking for characters and drama, and people that maybe shouldn't be doing what they were doing. I mean, in hindsight, Aubrey McClendon and Tom Ward grew too quickly. In hindsight, Harold Hamm should have been more focused on free cash flow. That makes sense reasonably, but as a storyteller, it's not what I want.
Yeah, no question. So since, like I mentioned, I love books. We love books. I was really interested as reading through your story, what your kind of, what work did you go to originally to get more background? Obviously, you were interviewing a lot of people like Hamm, like Mitchell, etc. Were there other books that you went to get a really good background in this industry?
Yeah, I kind of read everything and anything at the time. I threw myself into it. Obviously, all of Daniel Jurgens' books were really helpful. There was a book that Mitchell's people wrote. It's kind of an obscure book. I don't even remember the title, frankly. I got it on Amazon. It was expensive. There aren't many that are published, and it was a lot of technical stuff, but it told the history of the Barnett, which I found really helpful. There was a book about the Oklahoma and the Penn and that whole collapse that was helpful. That's escaping me right now, but that was helpful. But frankly, I just talked to a lot of veterans, a lot of people in industry that had been through the ups and downs, and people who worked for Mitchell, and they were really helpful. I could not have done this book without them. I thank some of them in the acknowledgments of the Frackers, so I encourage people to check that out. But people are much more willing to share and to help than one might think. And I do have to make the point that it was such a privilege to travel the country and go to these little towns in Oklahoma, North Dakota, and spend time in Pennsylvania and Texas and get to know other kinds of people. And we don't have that opportunity enough in society today. And it's led to this big divide. And again, with my new book, with the vaccines and people, everything's politicized in American society, and it's so sad. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that we just don't have an opportunity to meet each other. And I had that opportunity, and I'm so grateful that I could break bread with people in little towns in Oklahoma and get to know each other. And when you do, you realize we have so much more in common than you would think. And people on the East Coast are very wary and people on the West Coast, we're all very wary of those in the heartland, and vice versa. And it's like tribal at this point, my team versus your team. And it's so sad for me because we're all Americans and we share so much more than you would think. And we just don't get a chance to meet each other. And yeah, maybe we have disagreements and different lifestyles to some extent. But again, we have much more in common than we have that opposes us. So I wish people had that opportunity that I had, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah, in your book, you talk about Mark Papa and kind of the pivots his company had to do. You know, EOG Resources came out of Enron. It's obviously standing for Enron Oil and Gas. They then get to 2007. We are in Phoenix, Arizona at our company, and within 15 minutes of our office, he's sitting there telling all of executives that we got to get out of the gas business. We got to move to oil. There's way too much gas out there. So, I think about the pivots and the evolution of this industry. Here we are in 2021. If you had to revise this or add on to it, is there a company, is there a person, or is there a storyline that you'd love to grasp and add on to this?
Oh, Papa and what he did is both impressive and surprising. I mean, just to give your audience a little sense, they were doing really well. They went to this retreat, as you said, in Arizona to celebrate. They were producing all this natural gas. And this was around 2008 or so, 2009, maybe just a little bit after. And he was scared to death. His employees were high-fiving and celebrating. And Mark Papa said, well, hold on a second. If we're producing all this all this gas, this natural gas, maybe others are also, and maybe there's a glut coming, and then we're in trouble. Prices are going to collapse. So guys, stop celebrating, stop high-fiving. We've got to shift gears. And then he said, let's target oil. And it's easy to forget, but back then, people were not very optimistic about targeting shale for oil. Yeah, it's one thing, natural gas, that's a little bit easier, but oil is that much harder. And much like George Mitchell had to convince his own employees, and he met into resistance people around him, and much like Aubrey and Harold Hamm, people on the outside were skeptical, but Mark Papa said, hey, let's go after oil in the United States. Shale oil? What, are you kidding me? And he ignored the skepticism. And my book, The Frackers, is really about ignoring the conventional wisdom and perseverance and resilience. And that's what they showed. And they turned on a dime and they targeted oil. And they were able to become an oil giant. EOG became, thanks to that stroke of brilliance on the part of Mark Papa, but beyond that, his perseverance and his ability to persuade his own colleagues, let alone investors and others in the industry.
So, Greg, this has been just so much fun. Is there anything in your book that we didn't touch on, or that, like I said, as we step forward to 2021, that you think is missing that hasn't been said?
I think it's really important just to acknowledge the types of people in this industry and the innovation I mentioned, the creativity. It's a story, it's an American story. A lot of immigrants, a lot of people in my book, The Frackers, had their back to the wall and didn't know what to do. A lot of the theme that emerges is sort of necessity really is the mother of invention. I mean, George Mitchell, they were running out of oil and gas, so he had to shift gears and target the Barnett and shale. It was sort of his last shot. And sometimes you need to have your back to the wall to come up with this creativity. And I never, ever count this industry out as a result. But that's kind of one theme that really emerged. Sharif Suki, too. Remember Sharif Suki? He was under pressure of his own in 2008. He had to come up with some creative solution. And instead of importing gas, he's like, all right, let's export gas. And it's easy to say in hindsight, but that's what he should have done. But no one was even thinking about it at the time. And you see it in other industries too. I mean, Microsoft, and you see also in industries how it's often the smaller upstarts that bring change and bring a revolution. And I'm always, as a writer, I'm always looking for those smart upstarts. And again, you see it in other industries too. I mean, Microsoft had this search business, advertising, they closed it down. That allowed Google to emerge. You see it over and over again. In big pharma, again, this book I just wrote, A Shot to Save the World, it's about a little company in Germany that ended up saving the world. you see it over and over again. The upstarts are better at innovating than the giants, and you see it in the frackers as well.
Well, I think your idea of back against the wall is just like a wonderful way to leave us off here, because as we've kind of been teasing about, Greg, we definitely saw backs to the wall in the spring of 20, and many of these people had to live through that. So if I haven't said it before, Greg's book, The Frackers, is the best book I've read of how we've arrived at today's energy business, and the drilling techniques used, the people in the room, the companies that have succeeded and survived. Greg, I'm going to put your newest book on my reading list, A Shot to Save the World. Greg, where can listeners of the podcast get that book?
So A Shot to Save the World is available on Amazon, most local bookstores as well. And I encourage people to reach out to me, LinkedIn, Twitter, email, both about the Frackers or my other work. I'd love to hear reactions, constructive criticism even. Some of my best sources are people that had read a book and said, yeah, I like it, Greg, here's a point you missed. And I love hearing that. So with my new book, A Shot to Save the World, or with my previous work, I'd love to hear from people.
Greg, we're very thankful and blessed by your writing. Like I said, I'm going to add A Shot to Save the World to my book list. I'd love to have you back on sometime if it works. And we look forward to the next episode of A Book with Legs podcast.
Thanks for having me. And the Frackers was, frankly, my most fun experience writing a book, traveling the country, meeting interesting, fascinating individuals in the heartland. So I invite people to reach out to me and stay in touch.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smead Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smead Capital Management and its products at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.